At a liquidation auction inside Carter Dynamics headquarters, CEO Madison Blake tossed 6 burned-out motors at Ryan Cole as a public joke, while the entire boardroom laughed along with her. Ryan was nothing more than a struggling single father, a man who had already lost his workshop, his reputation, and almost every shred of hope he had left. But when he pried open the scorched casing of the first motor that night, he uncovered an engineering secret that had been buried for years. From that pile of scrap metal, a $500 million empire began rising in complete silence. Stay until the end, because the cruelest joke of all was about to set up a reckoning nobody saw coming. The auction floor inside Carter Dynamics headquarters in Detroit had the cold polish of money that never had to explain itself. Crystal pendant lights hung over rows of folding chairs filled with small contractors, independent engineers, and scrap buyers hoping to scoop up decommissioned equipment for pennies on the dollar. The air smelled faintly of machine oil and expensive cologne, 2 worlds pretending to share the same room for one afternoon. Ryan Cole sat near the back in a jacket that had seen better winters, his boots stained with the permanent dark patina of motor grease. He had not come to be noticed. He had come because his rented workshop was 3 months behind on rent, and a handful of working industrial motors could be the difference between staying open and locking the door for good. Madison Blake entered the way she entered every room she owned, which was every room she had ever been in since she was 26 years old. She knew exactly who Ryan Cole was, because everyone in that part of the industry eventually learned his name, usually as a cautionary tale rather than a compliment. He was the engineer who had once worked in advanced drive-fun train research, the one who got blamed for a fire that ended his career before it had truly started. To Madison, his presence in that auction room was not a coincidence worth ignoring. It was an opportunity, a chance to remind her board and her partners exactly what happened to people who failed at Carter Dynamics. She watched him from across the room the way a cat watches something it already considers caught. Ryan had raised his hand for a modest lot of small industrial motors, units that still had a few years of honest work left in them. Madison cut in before the auctioneer could finish the sale, her voice smooth and amused as she redirected attention toward a different lot entirely. 6 enormous motors were wheeled in on a flatbed cart, their casings scorched black, their housings streaked with rust and the kind of damage that suggested a fire long ago. She announced, loudly enough for the cameras near the back wall to catch it, that this lot was perfect for a man who specialized in fixing things nobody else wanted. The room laughed in the particular way. Rooms laugh when the powerful person in it has just given permission to mock someone safely. The gavel came down on a sale price of $1. And Luke's Grant, standing near Madison's shoulder, added that Ryan could always use the burned-out shells as dinner tables back at his shop. More laughter followed, sharper this time, the kind designed to leave a mark rather than simply pass the time. Ryan said nothing in his own defense because he had learned years earlier that defending himself in rooms like this only fed the appetite of the people laughing. Instead, he studied the 6 motors with the quiet, total attention of a man who had spent his whole life reading machines the way other people read faces. Something on the casing of the nearest unit caught his eye, a small stamped symbol nearly erased by soot and time. He had seen that exact mark once before, on a classified design document buried so deep in his memory he had almost convinced himself it never existed. He signed the transfer paperwork while the laughter in the room was still settling, his pen moving steadily despite the heat rising in his chest. Madison believed in that moment that she had handed Ryan Cole nothing more than a cruel joke wrapped in scrap metal. She turned back to her board members, already moving on to the next lot, already forgetting the small, tired man at the back of the room. Ryan wheeled the 6 burned motors out of the building and loaded them onto a borrowed trailer, the cold evening air doing little to cool the slow burn under his collar. No one in that gleaming room understood what they had just given away. Carter Dynamics had handed the man they once destroyed the first 6 keys to an empire none of them could yet imagine. Ryan had not always been the man people pointed at and laughed about. Years earlier, he had been one of the most promising engineers inside Carter Dynamics' advanced drivetrain division, the kind of mind that senior staff quietly relied on when a problem refused to behave. He had proposed a new thermal management approach for high-output motors, a design meant to solve overheating issues that had plagued the company's most ambitious product line. During a live test of that design, a fire broke out in the testing bay, and within weeks the entire project was frozen and quietly buried. Ryan was told in a meeting that lasted less than 10 minutes that he had deviated from approved specifications and caused the failure. He lost his position, his reputation, and any real chance of working at that level again, all without ever seeing a shred of evidence against him. He had always known, somewhere deep in his chest, that the failure had not been his fault, but knowing something and proving it were very different animals. Critical pieces of testing data had vanished from the company servers in the days following the fire, conveniently erasing the trail that might have cleared him. The final incident report had been signed off by Lucas Grant, a fact Ryan noted at the time and never quite managed to forget. He had considered legal action once, sitting across from a lawyer who quoted him a retainer larger than anything he could imagine paying. Without money, without documentation, and without anyone willing to risk Carter Dynamics' anger on his behalf, he let the matter die the slow death of practical defeat. He told himself it was the only choice available to a man with a daughter to feed and no savings left to burn on a fight he might lose anyway. What remained for Ryan was a small rented workshop on the edge of town, where he repaired industrial pumps, generators, and aging motors for farms and small manufacturers who could not afford anything fancier. The work was exhausting and the margins were thin, but he kept his word to every customer who walked through the door, and that mattered to him more than most people understood. He no longer dreamed of recognition or a return to the world that had discarded him so easily. He wanted something smaller and in its own way harder to hold on to, a quiet, steady life and a roof that stayed over his daughter's head. A single photograph of the two of them sat on the corner of his workbench, half hidden behind a stack of invoices, never discussed, always present. He worked late most nights not because the work demanded it, but because every extra hour meant one more brick in the wall he was building around Hannah's future. The humiliation in that auction room had stung, but it had not broken him because very little could break a man who had already survived losing everything once before. What stayed with him on the drive home was not the laughter, or Lucas Grant's cheap joke about dinner tables. It was the small stamped symbol hidden under the burned paint, a mark he was almost certain belonged to a classified prototype line that officially never existed. He suspected, even before he had a chance to confirm it, that Madison Blake had no idea what she had just handed him in front of her own board. Rain began falling as he pulled the trailer into the alley behind his shop, the kind of cold spring rain that made everything feel heavier than it was. Neighbors peered out from behind curtains, certain the man hauling 6 dead motors through the storm had finally lost what little sense he had left. Ryan switched on the single overhead light in his workshop and guided the first motor onto the lift table with careful patience of a surgeon rather than a scrap dealer. He ran his palm along the scorched casing, feeling for the ridges and welds that told the story machines could never speak aloud. Under his breath, almost too quiet to hear over the rain hammering the tin roof, he said that if the symbol meant what he thought it meant, Carter Dynamics had just made the worst mistake of their corporate history. He did not yet know how right he was, or how far the consequences would travel. He only knew that something about those 6 burned shells refused to sit quietly in the corner of his shop like ordinary scrap. For the first time in years, Ryan Cole felt something close to purpose stirring underneath the exhaustion. The next morning he began stripping the first motor down to its bones, expecting little more than confirmation of what everyone else assumed. A dead, worthless hunk of metal fit only for the recycling yard. The outer casing crumbled away easily, revealing copper windings snapped in several places and bearings shattered beyond any reasonable repair. An untrained eye would have stopped there and called the unit a total loss without a second thought. Ryan kept going, because something about the welding pattern beneath the damage looked far too precise for mass production work. The seams were hand-finished, not stamped out by a factory line, the kind of careful craftsmanship reserved for prototypes rather than commercial inventory. He set the casing aside and reached for a loop, the same one he had used years earlier in a laboratory he had once been proud to walk into. Closer inspection revealed details that made his pulse quicken in a way it had not done in a very long time. The rotor core bore a serial code that had been deliberately ground down, though not thoroughly enough to erase it completely under magnification. A layer of insulating material lined the casing's interior, a compound Ryan recognized immediately as something Carter Dynamics had never used in any motor sold to the public. The cooling channel pattern, a spiral design intended to pull heat away from the core more efficiently than standard straight vents, was unmistakably his own idea from years before. Tucked near the base of the housing sat a small thermal sensor, miraculously intact despite the fire damage surrounding it. None of these details belonged in a motor destined for the scrap heap. They belonged in a research prototype someone had tried very hard to make disappear. Memory came rushing back to Ryan in pieces, the way memory often does when the right key finally turns in the right lock. Years before the fire that ended his career, he had proposed a new generation industrial motor capable of cutting energy consumption by nearly 40% compared to anything on the market. The project had been shelved immediately after the accident, with company leadership publicly declaring the design too dangerous and impractical to ever commercialize. Yet here, sitting on his workbench, was undeniable physical proof that someone inside Carter Dynamics had continued developing that very design long after Ryan had been pushed out the door. The implications settled over him slowly, like fog rolling across a familiar field at dusk. If the company had truly believed his work was worthless, there would have been no reason to keep testing it in secret for years afterward. By the time Ryan had finished examining all 6 units, a pattern emerged that no auctioneer or laughing boardroom could have predicted. These were not 6 identical failures destined for the same fate. They were 6 distinct experimental branches of a single evolving design, each one testing a different piece of the puzzle. The first motor had been built to test rotor geometry, the second to test rare earth magnet placement, and the third to test advanced cooling architecture. The fourth carried experimental sensor arrays, the fifth housed a custom control unit, and the sixth tested an entirely new casing alloy. Individually, they were broken curiosities, but together, properly understood, they represented something close to a complete blueprint for a motor far ahead of anything currently sold by Carter Dynamics or anyone else in the industry. The tension of that discovery sharpened considerably when Ryan found a small data drive lodged inside the burned control unit of the fifth motor, half melted but possibly not entirely dead. He had no idea yet whether the data could be recovered, and he understood immediately what it would mean if Carter Dynamics realized that drive still existed. A company willing to bury an entire research project and quietly blame an innocent engineer for its failure would not hesitate to reclaim evidence that could expose them. Ryan locked the workshop door that night for the first time in longer than he could remember, sliding an old steel bar across the frame for good measure. He called Evelyn Brooks the following morning, choosing his words carefully, asking only whether a buyer had any legal right to study equipment a company had voluntarily discarded as scrap. Evelyn's answer was immediate and direct. Keep every receipt, every auction document, every photograph of the equipment's condition, because someday those details might matter far more than either of them yet understood. News of the auction joke traveled back to Carter Dynamics in the casual, careless way office stories often do, passed around during an internal meeting as a piece of harmless entertainment. Madison retold the story of the 6 burned motors with obvious relish, and several junior executives laughed along in the practiced way people laugh when they want to stay in a powerful woman's good graces. Carter Blake, sitting at the head of the table, did not laugh nearly as much as the rest of the room. He asked, almost offhandedly, which storage lot the 6 units had come from, a question that seemed to mean nothing to anyone except the one man in the room who suddenly went very still. Lucas Grant felt his stomach tighten the moment he heard the lot number spoken aloud in front of the board. He excused himself shortly after the meeting and pulled up the liquidation records on his own terminal, scanning line after line until he found what he feared he would find. That lot of 6 motors had never been authorized for public sale. It belonged to a research archive that was supposed to have been destroyed years earlier, quietly and permanently. Somewhere along the administrative chain, a clerical error had let it slip into the general liquidation inventory instead. Lucas understood almost immediately that Ryan Cole, of all people, was now the only person outside the company who might recognize exactly what those motors represented. The realization sat in his chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples he could not yet control. He had spent years building a comfortable life on top of a secret he had assumed was buried deep enough to stay hidden forever. Madison, for her part, remained entirely untroubled by any of it, certain that a man with no money, no staff, and no remaining reputation posed no realistic threat to a company worth billions. She told her assistant that a former engineer fixing irrigation pumps in some rented shed could hardly shake the foundations of an empire like Carter Dynamics. She did not notice the change in Lucas's posture, the new tightness around his eyes whenever Ryan's name came up in conversation. Lucas suggested, in a tone he hoped sounded purely procedural, that the company offer to buy back the 6 units in order to avoid any potential environmental liability. Madison agreed without much thought, treating it as a minor housekeeping matter rather than anything worth her real attention. She had no idea that the man pulling the strings beside her was acting purely out of fear rather than diligence. A company representative arrived at Ryan's workshop 2 days later, offering $5,000 for the same 6 motors that had sold for $1 at auction. Ryan listened politely, then asked the obvious question: why would scrap worth $1 suddenly become worth $5,000? The representative stumbled through a vague explanation about company recovery policy, clearly uncomfortable and clearly unprepared for the question. Ryan declined the offer with the same calm he had shown in the auction room, thanking the man for his time before closing the workshop door behind him. The moment he was alone again, he understood with total clarity that he had stumbled onto something the company badly wanted back. He moved the 6th motor to a small secondary storage unit across town that same evening and sent copies of every photograph, every invoice, and every disassembly note to Evelyn for safekeeping. Lucas received word that Ryan had refused the buyback offer, and the news landed harder than he expected it to. He pulled an old personnel file from deep storage, one bearing Ryan's name and a single damning line near the bottom: prototype failure assigned to Cole. He stared at that line for a long time, remembering exactly how it had come to be written and exactly whose signature had authorized it. If Ryan somehow managed to recover usable data from those scorched units, the carefully constructed story Lucas had told for years might finally start to unravel. For the first time since the accident, he felt something closer to real fear than mere professional annoyance. He had built an entire career on top of a lie that he had assumed no one would ever be in a position to challenge. Back at his workshop, Ryan approached the 6 motors with the discipline of a man who understood that rushing now could ruin everything he had already uncovered. He refused to dive straight into repairs, choosing instead to sort the units by function and chart his findings on a handwritten board nailed to the workshop wall. Each motor, damaged as it was, held a piece of a larger answer waiting to be assembled. The first unit's rotor had burned badly, but its core structure remained intact enough for Ryan to recognize a vibration reduction design Carter Dynamics had once formally rejected as impractical. He spent days recreating the rotor's exact geometry using an old design program and careful manual measurements, cross-checking every dimension against memory and instinct built over years of hands-on experience. Slowly, painstakingly, a clearer picture of the original engineering intent began to take shape under his hands. The second motor held rare earth magnets cracked from heat exposure but still arranged in a configuration Ryan had never seen used commercially. The magnetic field alignment was designed specifically to minimize energy loss during operation, a detail that could translate into a meaningful efficiency advantage over anything currently sold in the industrial market. The third motor's cooling system had failed catastrophically, but the failure told its own story once Ryan traced the cause back to its source. The fire years earlier had not resulted from his original thermal design at all. It had resulted from Carter Dynamics quietly substituting a cheaper insulating material that fell well below the standard his proposal had called for. It was the first concrete piece of evidence suggesting he had been blamed for a failure caused entirely by someone else's cost-cutting decision. He sat with that realization for a long while, feeling something between vindication and quiet, controlled anger settle into his chest. The fourth motor still carried partial sensor logs, fragments Ryan managed to recover after long nights of careful, patient work under a magnifying lamp. The data showed the unit had registered a clear overheating warning moments before the fire occurred, a warning that should have triggered an automatic shutdown. Someone, somewhere in the system, had manually overridden that warning before the failure happened. The fifth motor's control unit had been the hardest to save, its casing nearly fused shut by heat, but Ryan eventually managed to extract a working memory chip from its core. Buried in the recovered code was an internal signature that did not belong to him, a digital fingerprint left behind by whoever had accessed the override controls that night. The sixth motor's outer shell used an experimental alloy expensive enough that no company would have wasted it on a project they genuinely considered worthless and abandoned. Late one night, surrounded by disassembled parts and the low hum of an old space heater, Ryan looked down at his own hands, stained black with grease in a way that had become almost permanent over the years. He realized with a clarity that felt almost startling that he was no longer simply repairing 6 broken machines. He was reconstructing the very project that had once cost him everything, piece by piece, motor by motor, late into the quiet hours when the rest of the world had stopped paying attention. The 6 units could never run independently of one another, not in their current condition, but Ryan understood he now had enough knowledge to design something entirely new from what he had learned. He wrote 3 words on the workshop board in thick black marker: Coal Drive, version 1. It was a small, almost private gesture, but it marked the first true seed of something that would eventually grow far larger than anyone in that auction room could have ever imagined. Money remained Ryan's most immediate obstacle, since building even a single working prototype required materials he simply could not afford on a repair shop's income. He scavenged usable components from older machines sitting unused in the back of his workshop and borrowed precision measuring tools from a few loyal customers who trusted him enough to ask no questions. He eventually sold his second vehicle, an old work truck he barely used anymore, to fund the purchase of a proper inverter and insulation material that actually met industry standards. Evelyn visited the workshop in person not long after, finding Ryan surrounded by coils of copper wire, scattered blueprints, and half-disassembled motors stacked along every available wall. She admitted she was worried about him taking on a company with the size and resources of Carter Dynamics. Ryan told her, without drama or anger in his voice, that he was not interested in revenge. He simply wanted the truth to exist somewhere outside his own memory. Evelyn, ever practical, insisted that Ryan begin keeping a detailed daily log of every step in his development process, separating what he had legally purchased from what he was now personally inventing. She explained, patiently and clearly, that the line between inherited property and new intellectual contribution would matter enormously if Carter Dynamics ever decided to challenge him in court. She also began quietly assembling documentation that could one day demonstrate the company had concealed a known design flaw rather than admit fault publicly. The first real test of Coal Drive version 1 did not go smoothly. The prototype shook violently, blew a fuse, and plunged the workshop into total darkness within seconds of being switched on. A few neighbors joked the next morning that Ryan had finally managed to set his own shop on fire after years of fixing everyone else's machines. He laughed along with them because there was nothing else useful to do, and went straight back to work without missing a single day. The second attempt fared only slightly better, the motor managing a full 17 seconds of stable rotation before stalling out completely under load. 17 seconds was nowhere near commercial viability, but it was more than enough time for Ryan to confirm that the efficiency gains he had calculated on paper were holding true in real conditions. He adjusted the cooling channel geometry, replaced a failing sensor, and rewrote the control algorithm late into the night, fueled by little more than black coffee and stubborn determination. Mason Reed arrived for the third test at Evelyn's quiet suggestion, walking into the workshop with the skeptical posture of a man who had been burned too many times by promising ideas that went nowhere. Ryan offered no lengthy pitch or rehearsed presentation. He simply flipped the switch and let the machine speak for itself. Coal Drive version 1 ran clean, stable, and remarkably efficient, consuming far less power than any commercial motor of comparable output that Mason had ever personally tested. Mason said nothing for a long moment, methodically checking and rechecking his own measuring equipment as though expecting to find an error somewhere in the numbers. He asked Ryan to run the test again, and the results held steady, refusing to be explained away as simple luck or coincidence. Something in the older man's expression shifted, the wariness slowly giving way to genuine, careful interest. He asked Ryan directly how much capital it would take to develop a commercially viable version of what he had just witnessed running in front of him. Ryan answered honestly, telling Mason he had already sold off enough of his life once before and had no intention of selling whatever remained of it again. Mason replied calmly that he had no interest in buying Ryan's soul. He wanted to invest in something capable of keeping Carter Dynamics awake at night, and for the first time in years, Ryan allowed himself to believe that a different future might actually be possible. With Evelyn handling the legal foundation and Mason providing the first round of capital, Coal Drive systems came into existence on paper within a matter of weeks, though it would take far longer to feel real. Mason's investment came with one condition Ryan welcomed rather than resented: he would keep full control over every engineering decision the company made going forward. The business began as little more than the same rented workshop, 3 loyal mechanics, a part-time bookkeeper, and a small lease storage unit down the road. Ryan had no interest in building a company that looked anything like Carter Dynamics, with its glass towers and its casual cruelty toward anyone deemed disposable. He built a culture instead around transparency, fair credit for technical work, and a flat refusal to let blame roll downhill onto the people with the least power to push back. That philosophy, simple as it sounded, earned him a loyalty among his small team that no amount of corporate polish could have purchased. ColdDrive's first product did not chase glamour or headlines. Ryan deliberately aimed at small manufacturers, water pumping stations, agricultural operations, cold storage facilities, and mid-sized production lines that larger competitors often overlooked. The advantages were practical rather than flashy. Lower energy consumption, reduced heat output, easier maintenance, and a noticeably longer working life than comparable units on the market. An older packaging plant agreed to test one of the early units after growing tired of its punishing monthly electric bill. Within a single month, the plant's energy costs dropped by a margin large enough to catch the attention of the owner's accountant. Word spread quietly from that one satisfied customer to several others in the surrounding area, the kind of organic growth that no advertising budget could have manufactured faster. Carter Dynamics barely registered the name ColdDrive at all during this period, dismissing it as just another small startup too insignificant to matter. Madison heard the name mentioned once or twice in passing and concluded almost instantly that it represented no real threat to a company of her size and standing. She told her staff that the market segment Ryan was chasing was simply too small to ever touch their major contracts. Lucas remained far less comfortable with the situation, though he still lacked the courage to bring his full concerns to Madison directly. Mason had floated the idea of pitching Ryan's story to the press, the tale of a humiliated single father turned quiet inventor, certain it would generate enormous public interest. Ryan refused outright, insisting that the product should speak first and the story, if it ever needed telling at all, could come later. That choice only deepened the mystery surrounding ColdDrive among the handful of engineers and buyers who had already seen the motors perform. Orders began arriving steadily, first one, then two, then a slow but unmistakable stream that kept the workshop lit late into the night more often than not. Ryan still had no idea that Madison continued to imagine him quietly repairing scrap metal in obscurity, while her own clients had quietly begun comparing electric bills behind closed doors. The first real warning sign appeared when a long-standing Carter Dynamics client delayed renewing a major service contract, citing an ongoing trial with a smaller, more efficient supplier. Madison felt a flicker of irritation but nothing close to genuine alarm at that stage. A second signal followed soon after when 3 separate manufacturing clients requested significant price reductions, openly citing performance data from a company called ColdDrive Systems as their justification. Carter Dynamics' own engineering team reviewed the figures expecting to find exaggeration or error, and found instead that the numbers were entirely accurate. Madison demanded to know exactly who stood behind ColdDrive Systems, expecting some well-funded competitor she had simply failed to notice sooner. When she finally heard the name Ryan Cole, she went silent for several long seconds before forcing out a laugh that carried no real confidence behind it. She could not reconcile the image of the broken, humiliated man from the auction floor with the engineering results now sitting on the table in front of her. Lucas pushed quietly for legal action, suggesting Ryan had stolen trade secrets that rightfully belonged to Carter Dynamics. Evelyn, however, had already prepared a thorough paper trail documenting the auction purchase, every stage of development, and every original improvement Ryan had personally engineered from that point forward. Carter Dynamics found itself without anything close to a solid legal foundation to stand on, no matter how badly Lucas wanted one to exist. Madison eventually invited Ryan to headquarters under the polite language of exploring a potential partnership, though her real goal was buying ColdDrive at a fraction of its true value before it grew any larger. Ryan agreed to the meeting not out of financial need, but because some part of him wanted to walk back into the very room that had once laughed at his expense. Madison opened with an offer of $3 million, framing it as a generous final opportunity for Ryan to return to the professional world on respectable terms. Ryan calmly placed a printed performance report on the polished table between them, letting the numbers speak before he ever said a word himself. He told her she was not really trying to buy a company. She was trying to buy his fear, and that particular asset had never been for sale. Madison's expression hardened as she warned him that he had no idea who he was choosing to stand against, and Ryan answered that he understood perfectly well, since Carter Dynamics itself had taught him that lesson the hard way years earlier. Lucas, increasingly desperate as ColdDrive's momentum continued building, made a decision that would ultimately destroy what little security he had left. He quietly hired someone to sabotage the electrical systems at Ryan's workshop the night before an important product demonstration scheduled for a major potential client. The resulting overload struck just hours before the event, wiping out a significant portion of recent testing data and damaging the primary commercial prototype. Ryan arrived in time to contain the fire before it spread, though the equipment damage was severe enough to threaten the entire demonstration. Rather than panic, he focused immediately on the technical pattern of the failure itself, noticing an unsettling resemblance to the very accident that had ended his career years before. In both cases, a thermal warning system had been deliberately disabled from outside the unit rather than failing on its own. Evelyn moved quickly to investigate, comparing the new incident against fragments of data Ryan had previously recovered from motors 4 and 5 back during his earliest analysis. The exact same override code appeared in both instances, an unmistakable digital fingerprint pointing directly toward an old administrative account once used by Lucas Grant. The discovery confirmed something Ryan had quietly suspected for weeks. The original fire that destroyed his career had never been his fault at all. Carter Dynamics had secretly replaced his approved insulating material with a cheaper substitute to cut costs, and when the resulting overheating triggered a warning, Lucas had disabled it rather than risk halting the test in front of important investors. After the fire occurred, Lucas had simply redirected blame onto Ryan to protect his own position and the company's carefully managed reputation. Mason urged Ryan to release the evidence publicly without delay, but Evelyn cautioned that timing would matter as much as the truth itself if they wanted to protect both Ryan's reputation and his company's future. Working through the night with his small, exhausted team, Ryan rebuilt the damaged prototype using backup designs drawn directly from his original analysis of the 6 recovered motors. By morning, he stood in front of the scheduled client looking tired but entirely unshaken, ready to demonstrate a machine that had nearly been destroyed only hours earlier. ColdDrive version 2 ran flawlessly under heavy load, its intelligent cooling system performing exactly as designed even under conditions meant to stress it to failure. The client watched the numbers in real time, visibly impressed by both the efficiency gains and the obvious safety improvements built into the unit. Before the demonstration even concluded, a representative from a major logistics company signed a formal letter of intent to purchase ColdDrive motors for an upcoming facility expansion. News of the successful demonstration spread quickly through industry circles, and ColdDrive's projected valuation climbed sharply within days, leaving Lucas pale and increasingly desperate as he watched the recorded footage circulate among people who mattered. The momentum following the logistics contract proved impossible for anyone to ignore, as larger manufacturers began reaching out to ColdDrive faster than Ryan's small team could even respond to the inquiries. Industrial investment funds started competing for a position in the company, eager to attach themselves to what was quickly becoming one of the fastest-growing names in electric drivetrain technology. ColdDrive opened its first proper assembly facility not long afterward, though Ryan insisted on keeping his own office inside the original workshop as a permanent reminder of where the company had truly begun. He walked past rows of new equipment every morning with the same quiet humility he had carried since the very first day, never once forgetting the value of a single-dollar auction lot. When the Series B funding round finally closed, ColdDrive Systems was officially valued at $500 million. Mason told a room full of reporters that it stood among the fastest-growing electric drivetrain companies the industry had seen in over a decade. The story behind ColdDrive's rise inevitably found its way into the press, and the tale of 6 burned motors purchased for a single dollar became impossible for journalists to resist. Carter Dynamics, meanwhile, found itself sliding into a crisis it had never seriously prepared for. Shares dropped sharply as analysts raised uncomfortable questions about the company's stagnant technology and its sudden loss of several long-term clients. The board demanded answers from Madison, forcing her to finally investigate the true origin of the 6 motors she had once tossed at Ryan as a careless joke. Carter Blake admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that an advanced motor research project had indeed existed years earlier before being quietly shelved and ordered destroyed. He confessed he had never fully understood the depth of what Lucas had done to bury the project, nor the extent to which an innocent engineer had paid the price for it. A final, decisive meeting was called, and Madison summoned Ryan to discuss what she insisted on calling a negotiation, though everyone present understood it as something closer to a reckoning. The setting was deliberately familiar, the very same boardroom where Ryan had once stood quietly while an entire room laughed at his expense. This time he entered not as a struggling repairman clutching scrap metal, but as the founder and chief executive of a company now worth more than Carter Dynamics' own quarterly revenue. He needed no dramatic speech to make his presence felt. The silence that fell over the room the moment he walked through the door said more than words ever could have. Madison attempted one last maneuver, proposing a merger between the two companies framed as a mutually beneficial partnership. She suggested, carefully and almost gently, that cooperation now might allow certain unpleasant details from Ryan's past to quietly disappear from public memory. Ryan answered without raising his voice, telling her plainly that he had no interest in anyone quietly cleaning up his reputation through a private backroom deal. What he wanted and what he had built an entire company partly in pursuit of was the simple truth made fully public for anyone willing to look. Evelyn stepped forward at that point and laid out the complete body of evidence across the table for the entire board to see. There were original auction receipts proving the lawful purchase of the 6 motors, detailed development logs documenting every stage of Ryan's independent work, and recovered data confirming that a thermal safety warning had been deliberately disabled years earlier. Alongside that sat cleared documentation showing Lucas Grant had personally signed a falsified incident report blaming Ryan for a failure he never caused. Lucas tried weakly to dispute the findings, but the evidence in front of the board left no real room for denial. Carter Blake ordered the company's legal department to seal every related file immediately, his expression a mixture of anger and quiet, belated regret. Madison realized in that moment that she had been used by Lucas for years without fully grasping the extent of it, though she also understood she could not entirely escape responsibility herself. It had been her own arrogance and her company's culture of careless cruelty that had created the conditions for Lucas to operate so freely in the first place. The board voted that same week to suspend Lucas pending a full investigation, stripping him of every position and protection he had spent years carefully building. Madison was removed from her operating role shortly afterward, placed instead into a limited advisory position with far less authority than she had ever held before. Ryan left the boardroom without any visible satisfaction in his expression, because the victory he had won had never been about crushing another human being underfoot. In the months that followed, Carter Dynamics faced a formal internal investigation along with significant financial penalties tied to the years of concealed wrongdoing. Lucas found himself facing serious legal consequences of his own, the carefully built career he had protected through deception finally collapsing under the weight of truth. Madison either resigned from her remaining position or was quietly shifted into a role with no real operational power left to wield. Carter Blake issued a formal public statement apologizing directly to Ryan, acknowledging the company's failure to protect an innocent engineer from a lie that had cost him years of his life. Ryan's original technical records were finally corrected, restoring his professional reputation in writing rather than merely in private memory. Engineering schools and manufacturing companies alike began inviting him to speak, eager to hear the story directly from the man who had lived it. Ryan never framed his own story as an act of revenge whenever he spoke publicly about what had happened to him. He described it instead as a lesson about persistence and the quiet, stubborn value of holding on to the truth even when no one else seemed willing to believe it. Madison eventually visited his original workshop alone, without any assistants or cameras trailing behind her, a far different woman than the one who had once laughed so easily in that boardroom. She noticed one of the 6 original motors displayed inside a small glass case near the entrance, positioned not as a trophy but as a quiet reminder of how easily arrogance could blind even capable people to the truth. She apologized to Ryan, and this time the apology carried none of the calculated polish of corporate strategy behind it. She told him she finally understood, in a way she never had before, exactly what her own carelessness had nearly cost another human being. Ryan did not offer forgiveness easily or cheaply, because some wounds deserved more honesty than a single polite sentence could provide. He told her plainly that she had never truly destroyed him, though there had been moments when she came uncomfortably close to convincing him he had nothing left of value to offer the world. Every person, he added, eventually had to decide for themselves whether shame would curdle into cruelty or transform instead into fuel for something better. That evening he returned home later than he intended, pausing briefly at the small photograph still sitting on his desk, the one image of Hannah that had quietly anchored him through every difficult year. He said nothing more about it because some things mattered too much to turn into speeches. The moment passed quietly, the way most of the truly important moments in his life always had. Coldrive's new manufacturing facility hummed steadily with activity, its energy-efficient motors now finding their way into production lines scattered across the country. Ryan walked the factory floor regularly, moving among the workers not as a distant executive, but as a man who clearly remembered standing exactly where they stood now. The 6 burned motors that had once been thrown at him as a cruel joke eventually became something closer to an informal company legend, repeated quietly among new employees during their first week on the job. Nothing, it turned out, was ever truly worthless once it landed in the hands of someone willing to look deeper than the surface. No insult, however carefully aimed, could ever outlast a person who simply chose to stand back up afterward. Years later, people still told the story of the day Madison Blake handed Ryan Cole 6 broken motors as a joke, though almost no one remembered the laughter that had once filled that boardroom. What they remembered instead was that from 6 blackened pieces of scrap metal, an overlooked man had built a $500 million empire through nothing more than his own hands, the truth he refused to abandon, and a stubborn, quiet kind of resolve that no amount of ridicule could ever fully extinguish.